China's economy is set for a major shakeup in 2025. China stressed plans to boost growth in a high-level economic planning meeting that wrapped up last week. The annual economic planning conference noted that the Chinese economy has posted generally stable performance while making progress in 2024, but also recognized that we must face up to the difficulties. For the next year, the meeting called for a more proactive fiscal policy and affirmed plans to moderately loosen monetary policy. Why has China decided to ramp up policy stimulus? What obstacles and challenges can we expect in the new year? What signals does this all send, and where is China's economy headed in 2025? To answer these questions and more, I was pleased to be joined in the studio by Carl Fey, Professor of Strategy at BI Norwegian Business School in Oslo, Norway. So you have been on a 2 weeks tour in China. You are on the last day of it. You toured some Chinese cities, for instance, Chongqing, the municipality, and you were also touring Sichuan province in southwest China. You also talked with senior executives of companies, and of course you met with people in Shanghai and here in Beijing. What is the biggest takeaway for you so far on this trip?
Well, unfortunately, I think the biggest takeaway is a little bit of dampening of confidence in how the Chinese economy is going to unfold. But also in typical Chinese style, there's also optimism that it may be able to turn to be good, especially with hard work. And of course, it's encouraging to see that the government is taking the economy very seriously and has announced recently that they really want to put a big focus on trying to stabilize the economy. So I'm hopeful that maybe things won't return to growth levels that we've seen from years before, but not be quite as bad as some are fearing.
Well, let's talk about this very important meeting that I mentioned at the beginning of the show. Very significant, and a lot of analysis have been rolled out, for instance, on the new fiscal policy and the new monetary policy. For instance, as I said, the fiscal policy is going to be more proactive, and the monetary policy will be changed from one that is prudent to moderately loose. And that is the first time actually in the past 14 years. How do you look at this very bold move?
So I think it's great that the Chinese government is taking it seriously and trying to articulate more about what they would like to do. In fact, it's never great when things are not super, but it's even more important that there's some clarity about how things are going to be. We as humans just don't deal well with uncertainty. And so trying to provide some certainty, which is what I think the government is trying to do, is really helpful. What is most important? Well, most important is, of course, to deal with the real estate crisis. And some steps have been taken for that, but I think the government needs to do much more in this area. There is going to be pain. There's a certain amount of pain that's going to happen to get things back to normal. The options are have more pain quickly or spread that pain over a longer period of time. My strong advice is have more pain quickly so that one can get back to a more stable situation. What does it mean, more pain quickly? It means really figuring out which are the loans and so forth that one should really let fail, and which are those that one should support and help out. And exactly where that line is, I think, is less important than getting this done so that we get back to a stable situation.
Do you think the Chinese government have been doing the right thing, sending the right signal? Because this whole effort started very intensively since late September, and there have been some numbers, for instance, in terms of sales of property. There is a upticking of economic activity and interest in that regard. Do you think the signals are strong and clear and timely enough?
I think that the Chinese government is doing the right things, but I think it needs to do more and quicker. I think that I would push for, compressed series of pain, as I mentioned. But there are other things to stimulate the economy that I really think the Chinese government is doing a great job on. For example, one of the things they're doing is encouraging investment from individuals. For example, if you buy an EV, you can get some subsidy from the government. If you buy a new washing machine or a new refrigerator, you can do that. And they've just announced at the work meeting they're going to expand that to also some other electronic and even smaller appliances. This is important because you don't only get the stimulus of people deciding to buy something now, but those investments are actually being used in a good way that help things to be more efficient into the future. That is much better than, for example, the policy the US used, for example, during COVID times, where one was giving cash handouts. Then you can buy candy, you can do whatever you want with that, and it doesn't have any benefit after that short-term period.
Do you, since you mentioned this, I'm curious because a lot of criticism has been levied on the Chinese authority for not giving out cash, not boosting consumption in a quicker way. From what you just said, basically there is serious consideration behind how to boost consumption so that the money is not put in the bank, let's say, or thrown away, kind of.
Yeah, one of the ironies in China is that actually there is enough money to have growth in consumption already now. But the average Chinese consumer citizen saves a much higher percentage than people in most places in the world.
Already, yeah.
And so what we need to do is we need to make the consumers confident that the economy is going to be good, they're not going to lose a job, that the value of their real estate is not going to fall radically. And if they have that confidence, then they're going to spend more. And then secondarily, we need to encourage not just spending on frivolous things, but spending on investment that's going to benefit not only now, but in the future.
How do you look at the moderately loose monetary policy then in light of what you just said? Because there is a lot of cash already, a lot of saving, but then loose monetary policy means there will be more cash out there. Do you see a contradiction, potentially negative consequence of that?
Well, I mean, I think it's still good to have a little bit loosening of the monetary policy, which will, hopefully help to stimulate growth. The piece that I would be a little bit cautious of is there's also talk about potentially cutting back on reserves that are required in the banks. They
already did that a little bit.
That's right. And I wouldn't vote for doing that a whole lot more, simply because there have been some problems with bad loans and so forth.
Well, being someone who has lived in China for a couple of years, who travel very frequently and who have in-depth exchange with Chinese players, meaning executives, authorities, do you think the general tone of mainstream international media about the health of the Chinese economy is an objective one? Because if you read some of their reporting, it's like China's economy nearing the end of its line, and it's collapsing, it's probably already killed and stuff like that.
Now one is talking about, is China going to have 5% or 4.5% or 4% GDP growth? The pessimists think it's 4%. It would be positive headlines in most countries in the world if they could be talking about maybe getting 4% GDP growth. So we need to put this in perspective. Chinese economy is not going to be a disaster, and the Chinese government, is taking steps to try to stabilize things. Will it be slowing down a little bit? Probably. Is the international press fair on China right now? Absolutely not. Some of this, unfortunately, is just out of ignorance, and some of this is bringing politics into things a little bit more than it should be. This is a major problem that we need to address in both sides of the equation. And one of the things we need for this is to have more people from around the world coming to China, and from China going around the world. During COVID time, we really cut back a lot on travel, and even if you look today, there's still about half the number of flights to China that there were pre-pandemic. Yeah. We need to have more flow of people, like you and me meeting here. We get to know each other, understand each other better, Absolutely. Get rid of some misperceptions.
Absolutely. That's why we are, really cherishing this short period of time to get the most out of this moment. You are one analyst or researcher on what China calls new quality productive forces and related study. The meeting emphasized once again fostering new quality productive forces driven by scientific and technological innovation and developing a modernized industrial system. This sounds like, extraterrestrial term, but that's, I believe it's going to have far-reaching implications for the rest of the world. How do you understand this term? What exactly are these forces?
So it's important to realize that China does have a tendency of President Xi in particular, of coming up with these sort of terms. Like, remember more than a decade ago when President Xi started talking about the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, actually people didn't really know quite what this was. But with time, it became clear. This was a signaling, this is an important thing to focus on. Just like now, new quality productive forces, which is about China doing things to raise the productivity, to be more innovative, to add more value. China, has been the factory of the world. Now they want to transfer to being also the innovator of the world, adding more value, which is essential for people to be able to command the salaries that they're wanting. Now, so innovation is, I would say, what new quality productive forces is all about.
Innovation in terms of science and technology?
All sorts of innovation. It's not only that, also management innovation. In other words, doing things in different ways. Let me give you a few examples potentially. So I've recently completed a survey of about 200 companies in China and interviews with about 40 executives in these companies. And I'm looking about what management practices can help companies in China to be more innovative and exploring if this is not a little different than maybe what would work well in the US or in Europe. To give you an example of this, when we look at studies that have been done, for example, in the US, it's suggested you need to decentralize a lot to empower people, to drive innovation so people can act quickly on their ideas. But how do you reconcile that with the traditions of strong leadership in China? My research shows that, in fact, it is good to decentralize some, but not just radically, but you need to replace that strong leader with what I call formalization, which is making clear rules and procedures of how you should act, and also being more transparent. And there are companies like Haier, for example, that are following this, who have broken down into having lots of different micro enterprises. The white goods company from China that acquired GE Electric's white goods business. And now they have literally thousands of micro enterprises inside this one big company. This is following some of the same principles I just talked about.
So how do you look at the future, the immediate future? President Xi actually, while he was meeting the heads of the international organization, he said tariff war, trade war and tech war are against the trend of history and laws of economics, and they produced no winners. China will stay focused on managing its own affairs well and resolutely safeguard its sovereignty, security and development interests. At the same time, China's determination to advance high-level opening up will not change. Do you think he's trying to send a clear message to people in Washington? Will that be heeded?
I do think he's trying to send a clear message, and I do think it's a little bit ironic that today we see China being the country that is the big proponent of free trade, and the US being the protectionist country, which of course is reversing the roles that have historically been. I'm really happy that China is trying to push forward free trade. I hope the US will revert to its traditional position, but I'm not very optimistic that it happens in the short term. That doesn't seem to be Trump's desire. But on the positive side, Trump is concerned about business and financial results. And maybe he'll be open to discussion and learning and trying something different when he sees that it benefits the US. So I'm hoping that some dialogue between President Trump and President Xi might be fruitful, but not overly optimistic that that'll work out. This is actually my biggest concern for the world economy moving forward.